The silence in the briefing room was deafening. 23 pairs of eyes fixed on the surveillance footage playing on the wall-mounted screen, watching something that shouldn't have been possible. The timestamp read 3:47 hours, Nevada test range, and what they were witnessing would rewrite military aviation doctrine forever. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Ghost Thorne sat motionless in the back row, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching her colleagues' faces cycle through disbelief, anger, and grudging respect. The grainy thermal imagery showed six F-35 Lightning IIs executing what should have been a textbook 4 versus 1 engagement exercise. Should have been. Instead, they were watching those six aircraft systematically eliminated by a single pilot flying a modified F/A-18 Super Hornet that had no business surviving the encounter. "Replay it," Colonel Marcus Vega ordered, his voice tight with controlled frustration. This was the seventh time they'd watched the footage, and each viewing only deepened the mystery. How had one pilot, flying an aircraft a full generation behind the competition, managed to outmaneuver, outthink, and systematically dismantle six of the Navy's most advanced fighters? The answer sat in the back of the room, 34 years old, 5'6", with premature gray streaking through auburn hair pulled back in regulation style. Kestrel Thorne had 2,847 flight hours, 3 combat deployments, and a reputation that preceded her like a storm front. But what her file didn't mention, what nobody in that room knew, was that she'd spent 2 years embedded with SEAL Team 6 before returning to aviation. 2 years learning to think like prey that had evolved into a predator. "Ma'am," came a voice from the front row, tinged with skepticism, "care to explain how you defeated 6 modern fighters using tactics that aren't in any manual?" Captain Derek Walsh turned in his seat, his expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed contempt. At 28, he was the Navy's golden boy, top of his class at TOPGUN, and he'd been one of the 6 pilots humiliated in the exercise. Kestrel's gray-green eyes met his without blinking. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced death and found it wanting. "Counterambush isn't about the aircraft, Captain. It's about understanding that the moment you think you're the hunter, you've already become the hunted." The room fell silent again. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, and somewhere in that vastness, the echoes of an impossible victory still lingered in the thin air. The morning sun painted the Nevada mountains in shades of copper and gold as Kestrel walked toward the flight line, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder. The previous night's debriefing had ended with more questions than answers, and today promised to be even more complicated. Word had spread through Nellis Air Force Base like wildfire. The new pilot had embarrassed 6 of the Navy's best, and everyone wanted to know how. Her Super Hornet sat on the tarmac like a steel shark, its gray paint scheme dulled by desert dust and countless training flights. Unlike the pristine F-35s lined up nearby with their angular stealth profiles, her aircraft looked almost primitive, a throwback to an earlier era of aviation when pilots relied on skill rather than technology. But appearances, as Kestrel had learned long ago, could be devastatingly deceiving. "Ghost," called a voice behind her. She turned to see Commander Rachel Torres approaching, the squadron's operations officer and one of the few people who'd bothered to read Kestrel's complete service record. "Hell of a show last night. The boys are saying it was luck." Kestrel adjusted her grip on the helmet bag, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, ma'am. I just happen to be very prepared." Torres smiled grimly. 6 months ago, you were flying cargo runs out of Bahrain. Now you're making our best pilots look like flight school cadets. That's not preparation. That's something else entirely. The something else Torres was referring to had a name, though it wasn't written in any official report. Counterambush tactics, learned in the mountains of Afghanistan where Kestrel had spent 2 years as the only aviator attached to a SEAL team. While other pilots were perfecting air-to-air combat in controlled environments, she'd been learning how to survive when outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in conditions that would break most people's minds. "Today's different," Torres continued, checking her tablet. "We're running the Wraith Protocol. You familiar with it?" Kestrel's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind her eyes. The Wraith Protocol was the Navy's most advanced aerial combat simulation, designed to push pilots beyond their breaking point. It wasn't about winning. It was about seeing how long you could survive against impossible odds. The fact that they were throwing it at her after one successful exercise meant somebody wanted to prove a point. "I know it," she said simply. Torres nodded. "You'll be facing 8 aircraft this time. F-35s, F-22s, and 2 experimental drones. The simulation runs until you're eliminated or—" She paused, consulting her notes. "Well, it's never gone the other way." As Torres walked away, Kestrel stood alone with her thoughts and her aircraft. The desert wind whispered across the flight line, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and heated metal. In 6 hours, she would either vindicate everything she believed about aerial combat, or she would become another cautionary tale about overconfidence. She touched the small patch on her flight suit, a ghost silhouette against a black background, earned during those 2 years when she'd learned that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being invisible until the moment you chose to appear. The briefing room buzzed with tension as pilots filed in for the morning session. Kestrel entered last, taking her usual seat in the back while conversations died around her. The dynamics had shifted overnight. Where there had been indifference, now there was curiosity mixed with resentment. She'd proven that their assumptions about air combat might be wrong, and that made her dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with flying. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Hammer" Morrison stood at the front of the room, his weathered face bearing the scars of 20 years in naval aviation. Morrison had flown combat missions over Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and his reputation was built on victories earned through blood and determination. When he spoke, even the most arrogant pilots listened. "Yesterday's exercise has generated significant interest from Washington," Morrison began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Some people are calling it an anomaly. Others think we've discovered something worth studying." His eyes found Kestrel in the back row. "Today, we find out which group is right." The tactical display illuminated behind him, showing a 3-dimensional map of the Nevada test range. Red and blue icons indicated starting positions, and the complexity of the scenario was immediately apparent. 8 aircraft arranged in a sophisticated ambush pattern, with Kestrel's blue icon isolated in the center like prey in a spider's web. "The Wraith Protocol simulates the worst-case scenario any pilot can face," Morrison continued. "You're alone, outnumbered, and operating in contested airspace with limited support. The objective isn't to win, it's to survive as long as possible while gathering intelligence on enemy positions." Captain Walsh leaned forward in his seat. "Sir, with respect, shouldn't we be focusing on realistic scenarios? When was the last time a single pilot faced 8 hostiles alone?" Morrison's smile was grim. "Ask Lieutenant Commander Thorne about realistic scenarios, Captain. She might have some interesting perspectives." All eyes turned to Kestrel, but she remained motionless, her attention fixed on the tactical display. She was already running calculations, analyzing approach vectors and defensive positions with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before, not in simulation, but where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. "The exercise begins at 1400 hours, Morrison announced. "Full weapons simulation, no restrictions on tactics or engagement parameters. Questions?" The silence stretched until Captain Walsh raised his hand again. "What aircraft will Lieutenant Commander Thorne be flying?" "Same Super Hornet she used yesterday," Morrison replied. "Any other questions?" There were none. The room emptied quickly, leaving Kestrel alone with her thoughts and the weight of expectations. Through the window, she could see her aircraft waiting on the tarmac, and beyond it, the vast expanse of desert where she would either prove her worth or discover the limits of her abilities. The pre-flight inspection revealed nothing unusual about Kestrel's Super Hornet, but she conducted it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Every rivet, every control surface, every system received the same methodical examination that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments and countless training exercises. Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos watched from nearby, her experienced eyes nodding the pilot's ritual-like attention to aircraft preparation. Santos had been turning wrenches on Navy aircraft for 18 years, and she'd learned to read pilots like technical manuals. This one was different, calmer, more focused than the usual collection of ego-driven aviators who treated aircraft like video game controllers. "Ma'am," Santos called out, approaching with a tablet in her hands. "We've uploaded the modified software package you requested. Navigation system's been updated with the terrain-following protocols, and the countermeasures suite is running the latest threat library." Kestrel looked up from her inspection of the port engine intake. "What about the communications array?" "Configured for burst transmission only, just like you specified. Might I ask why you're planning to go silent during the exercise?" The question hung in the desert air between them. Kestrel straightened, wiping her hands on a maintenance rag, and for a moment Santos caught a glimpse of something in the pilot's eyes, a knowledge born of experience that went far beyond routine training exercises. "Ghosts don't announce their presence, Chief," Kestrel said simply. "They appear when they choose to, not when the enemy expects them." Santos nodded, though she didn't entirely understand. What she did understand was that this pilot had requested modifications that weren't standard for aerial combat exercises. Terrain-following navigation suggested someone planning to fly dangerously close to the ground. Burst communications indicated a pilot who intended to minimize her electronic signature. Together, they painted a picture of tactics that belonged more to special operations than conventional air warfare. "Your opposition's warming up," Santos observed, pointing toward the flight line where 8 aircraft were being prepared for launch. The F-35s and F-22s represented the cutting edge of American air power, their angular shapes designed to slip through enemy radar like technological phantoms. Beside them, 2 experimental drones sat silent and menacing, their AI-driven systems capable of reaction times no human pilot could match. Kestrel followed Santos's gaze, studying her opposition with the analytical mind of someone who'd spent years learning to identify threats and opportunities in seemingly impossible situations. 8 against 1 weren't terrible odds. She'd faced worse during her time with the SEALs, when survival depended on understanding that conventional thinking was often a luxury she couldn't afford. "They're good pilots," she acknowledged, "but they're thinking like hunters. And you're not." Kestrel's smile was barely visible beneath the brim of her flight cap. "Chief, I learned a long time ago that the best way to survive being hunted is to make sure you're never where the hunters expect to find you." The Wraith protocol commenced at exactly 1400 hours with 8 aircraft launching in perfect formation from Nellis Air Force Base. The F-35s rose first, their advanced engines lifting them into the crystal-clear Nevada sky with deceptive grace. The F-22 Raptors followed, their thrust-vectoring nozzles adjusting constantly as the pilots established their planned ambush positions. The 2 experimental drones launched last, their AI systems already processing thousands of variables per second in preparation for the coming engagement. Kestrel's Super Hornet remained on the ground as her opposition disappeared into the vastness above. In the control tower, mission controllers tracked 8 blue icons spreading across their tactical displays in a complex pattern designed to trap and eliminate a single adversary. Everything proceeded according to protocol, except for the fact that their primary target showed no signs of launching. "Ghost, you're cleared for immediate takeoff," came the radio call from tower control. "Your opposition is established and waiting." The radio remained silent. In the squadron-ready room, pilots and ground personnel gathered around television screens showing the live feed from the exercise. Commander Torres stood with her arms crossed, watching Kestrel's aircraft through the window while monitoring the tactical display that showed 8 hunters circling overhead like vultures. "What's she doing?" Captain Walsh asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "The exercise started 10 minutes ago." Torres' expression remained neutral, but she was beginning to understand something that the others hadn't grasped yet. The Wraith protocol assumed that the lone pilot would launch immediately and attempt to survive through superior flying skills and tactical awareness. But Kestrel Thorn wasn't operating under those assumptions. On the tactical display, the 8 aircraft continued their search pattern, burning fuel and time while their target remained mysteriously absent. The mission controllers were becoming agitated, repeatedly calling for Ghost to respond and join the exercise. But the radio remained silent, and the Super Hornet remained motionless on the tarmac. "Sir," one of the controllers called to Morrison, "should we scrub the mission? Ghost isn't responding to communications." Morrison studied the displays with growing interest. He'd flown enough combat missions to recognize unconventional thinking when he saw it, and what he was witnessing wasn't pilot error, it was strategy. "Negative. Continue the exercise. If Ghost wants to play games, we'll see how long she can stay on the ground." But Kestrel wasn't playing games. 2,000 feet below ground level, in a bunker beneath Nellie's Air Force Base, she sat before a bank of computer screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from satellites, ground-based radar systems, and electronic surveillance platforms. Her Super Hornet wasn't late. It was exactly where it needed to be, gathering information while her opponents revealed their positions, flight patterns, and tactical preferences. The first rule of counter-ambush operations: never engage until you understand the battlefield better than your enemies do. 23 minutes after the Wraith protocol officially began, Kestrel finally appeared. Not in the sky where 8 aircraft waited with growing impatience, but on the secure radio frequency reserved for mission controllers. "Control, Ghost requesting immediate launch clearance with flight plan modification." The transmission crackled through speakers in the tower, causing a stir among personnel who'd begun to wonder if the exercise had been canceled. Morrison grabbed a headset, his voice sharp with professional curiosity. "Ghost, you're 23 minutes late for your own exercise. Explain your status." "Negative, Control. I'm exactly on time. The exercise parameters specified survival against 8 hostiles in contested airspace. I've spent the last 23 minutes studying that airspace and identifying optimal engagement parameters." On the tactical display, the 8 blue icons continued their search pattern, but their formations were becoming ragged as fuel consumption, and pilot frustration began to affect their discipline. What had started as a coordinated ambush was slowly degrading into an increasingly desperate hunt for a target that refused to appear. "Ghost, clarify your intentions. Are you participating in this exercise or not?" The answer came not over the radio, but as a sudden change on the radar display. Kestrel's Super Hornet had finally launched, but not from Nellie's Air Force Base. Instead, her aircraft appeared on the scope flying nap of the Earth through a mountain valley 30 miles north of the exercise area, invisible to the searching aircraft until she chose to reveal herself. In the squadron-ready room, the assembled pilots stared at the display in confusion and growing respect. Captain Walsh's confident expression had been replaced by something approaching concern as he realized that Kestrel hadn't been late, she'd been repositioning. "How the hell did she get there?" someone whispered. Commander Torres smiled grimly. "She's been studying us while we've been hunting empty sky. Now she's about to show us what she learned. The tactical display updated again, showing Kestrel's aircraft climbing rapidly from the valley floor toward the unsuspecting formation above. Her approach vector was perfect, a blind spot in their coverage that she'd identified during her 23 minutes of careful observation. "All stations, this is Ghost," came the calm voice over the radio. "Exercise is now active. Good hunting." The first kill happened so quickly that the mission controllers initially thought it was a system error. Kestrel's Super Hornet appeared on the scope behind one of the F-35s, locked on with simulated missiles, and transmitted the kill signal before disappearing back into the radar clutter of the mountainous terrain below. "Viper 2 is down," came the frustrated voice of the eliminated pilot. "Ghost came out of nowhere, got tone, and vanished before I could react." The remaining 7 aircraft immediately broke formation, abandoning their planned ambush to hunt for a target that had proven she could appear and disappear at will. But Kestrel had already moved, using her knowledge of their search patterns to position herself for the next engagement. "Where is she?" Captain Walsh's voice crackled over the radio, his F-35 pulling hard GS as he attempted to locate the elusive Super Hornet. The answer came in the form of another kill signal as Kestrel eliminated a second F-35, this time from a completely different vector than her first attack. The tactical display showed her aircraft for exactly 3 seconds before it vanished again into the electronic noise of the mountain ranges. "Viper 3 is down. Ghost is using the terrain like she owns it." Morrison watched the display with growing fascination. What he was witnessing wasn't conventional air combat. It was something far more sophisticated. Kestrel was fighting like someone who'd learned that survival often meant rewriting the rules that everyone else accepted as gospel. "Control, this is Raptor Lead," came a new voice over the radio. Colonel Janet "Spike" Henderson was the Air Force's liaison to the exercise, flying one of the F-22s with 15 years of fighter pilot experience. "Request permission to modify engagement parameters. We need to force Ghost into open airspace." "Negative, Raptor Lead. Exercise continues under current parameters." Henderson's frustration was audible over the radio. "Sir, she's not fighting fair. These aren't standard tactics." In the ready room, Commander Torres turned to address the assembled pilots. "That's exactly the point. Fair fights are for training exercises. In real combat, fair fights get you killed." The third kill came 8 minutes later, and this time Kestrel's approach was so unexpected that the targeted pilot didn't even realize he'd been eliminated until the kill signal activated. She'd used a commercial airliner's contrail to mask her approach, climbing vertically behind the civilian aircraft before breaking off to engage her target from above. "Viper 4 is down. This is insane." 5 aircraft remained, and their pilots were beginning to understand that they weren't facing an opponent who played by conventional rules. Kestrel Thorne had spent 2 years learning special operations tactics, and she was applying that knowledge to aerial combat in ways that no training manual had ever anticipated. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who could appear anywhere at any time was beginning to show. Fuel levels were dropping as the remaining pilots flew increasingly erratic patterns, burning gas while trying to locate a target who seemed to exist only when she chose to kill. "All stations tighten formation," Colonel Henderson ordered. "We're letting her pick us off one by one. Stay close and watch your sectors." But staying close meant accepting reduced maneuverability, and Kestrel had already demonstrated that she could exploit any tactical weakness with lethal efficiency. The hunters were slowly becoming the hunted, and everyone monitoring the exercise could see it happening in real time. The fourth kill demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that left the mission controllers speechless. Kestrel had somehow positioned herself directly beneath the tight formation of remaining aircraft, using ground radar reflection to mask her approach, until she was close enough to simultaneously lock onto two targets. Viper 5 and Raptor 2 are down, came the dejected voice over the radio. Ghost got us both with a single engagement. 3 aircraft remained. Colonel Henderson in her F-22, Captain Walsh in his F-35, and one of the experimental drones whose AI systems were now working at maximum capacity to locate and engage the elusive target. "This isn't possible," Walsh transmitted, his voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "She's flying a 20-year-old Super Hornet against the most advanced fighters in the world." Henderson's response was grim. "The aircraft doesn't matter if the pilot knows how to use it, and this pilot knows things we don't." In the underground bunker, Kestrel monitored the radio chatter while studying satellite imagery of the remaining aircraft. Their formation was tight but predictable, and their flight patterns revealed growing desperation as fuel levels continued to drop. She had them exactly where she wanted them, reactive instead of proactive, responding to her initiative rather than executing their own plans. The fifth kill required patience. Kestrel spent 12 minutes positioning herself for an attack that would eliminate the AI-controlled drone, whose pattern recognition systems made it the most dangerous of her remaining opponents. When she finally engaged, it was from an angle that the drone's programming hadn't anticipated, a nearly vertical climb from a canyon that didn't appear on its tactical maps. "Drone 1 is down," announced Mission Control. "Ghost achieved lock from an impossible angle." 2 aircraft remained, and both pilots were running on adrenaline and rapidly diminishing fuel supplies. Colonel Henderson and Captain Walsh had been flying combat air patrol patterns for over an hour, and their situational awareness was degrading with each passing minute. "Control, fuel state critical," Henderson transmitted. "Request permission to RTB for refueling." "Negative," Raptor lead. "Exercise continues until conclusion." The conclusion came 15 minutes later in a display of aerial precision that would be studied at military academies for years to come. Kestrel appeared simultaneously in the engagement envelope of both remaining aircraft, forcing them to choose between engaging her or maintaining their defensive formation. When they broke to attack, she used their movement against them, positioning herself so that their own missiles would create fratricide opportunities. "Raptor 1 and Viper 1 are down," came the final, defeated transmission. Ghost achieved simultaneous kills with 0 losses. The Wraith protocol was over. 8 of the military's most advanced aircraft had been systematically eliminated by a single pilot flying an older generation Super Hornet, using tactics that weren't written in any manual. In the control tower, mission controllers stared at their displays in stunned silence, while the assembled pilots in the ready room tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Kestrel's voice came over the radio one final time, calm and professional as always. "Control, Ghost requesting clearance to return to base. Exercise complete." As her Super Hornet appeared on the scope heading home, Morrison slowly removed his headset. He just witnessed something that would change naval aviation forever, and he knew it. The question now was whether the military establishment would be willing to learn from what Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne had just taught them. The debriefing room felt different this time. Where there had been skepticism and barely concealed contempt 24 hours earlier, now there was silence filled with respect and uncomfortable questions. 8 of the Navy and Air Force's best pilots sat around the conference table, their egos bruised and their assumptions about air combat fundamentally challenged. Kestrel entered last, as had become her habit, but this time no conversations died when she appeared. Instead, there was a subtle shift in posture as experienced combat pilots acknowledged someone who had just demonstrated a level of tactical mastery that transcended conventional thinking. She took her usual seat in the back, her expression neutral as she waited for the inevitable analysis of her impossible victory. Commander Morrison stood at the front of the room, his weathered face reflecting 20 years of military experience, and the dawning recognition that everything he thought he knew about aerial warfare might need revision. The tactical display behind him showed the final positions from the Wraith Protocol, frozen in time at the moment of Kestrel's victory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying a weight of professional respect that hadn't been present in previous briefings. "What we witnessed yesterday represents the most comprehensive tactical victory in the history of the Wraith Protocol. 8 aircraft eliminated with 0 losses, using methods that, well, methods that we're still trying to understand." Colonel Henderson leaned forward in her chair, her F-22 pilot's confidence tempered by the memory of being outmaneuvered by an aircraft that shouldn't have been able to touch her. "Sir, I've been flying fighters for 15 years. What Lieutenant Commander Thorne accomplished yesterday wasn't just superior piloting, it was a complete reimagining of how air combat works." Morrison nodded, consulting his notes. The analysis teams have been working through the night, studying every aspect of Ghost's performance. What they've found challenges everything we teach at TOPGUN and the Air Force Weapons School. Captain Walsh, his earlier arrogance replaced by grudging professional curiosity, raised his hand. "What kind of challenges, sir?" "The kind that suggest we've been preparing for the wrong kind of war," Morrison replied. "Ghost didn't win because she was a better stick-and-rudder pilot, though her flying skills are exceptional. She won because she understood something we've forgotten, that tactics matter more than technology." The room fell silent as the implications of Morrison's words settled over the assembled pilots. These were men and women who had built their careers on mastering the most advanced weapons systems in human history, only to be systematically defeated by someone who treated those systems as merely tools in service of a larger strategic vision. "The preliminary analysis identifies several key factors," Morrison continued, switching to the next slide. "First, Ghost's use of pre-engagement intelligence gathering. While we were establishing our ambush pattern, she was studying us, learning our habits and identifying our weaknesses." "She was 23 minutes late to her own exercise," Walsh protested. Morrison's smile was grim. "She wasn't late, Captain. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. By the time she engaged, she knew more about our positions and intentions than we knew about hers." The next slide showed a map of the Nevada test range, with Kestrel's flight path traced in red. The route revealed a level of tactical sophistication that left the room speechless. A carefully planned series of approaches that used terrain, civilian air traffic, and even weather patterns to mask her movements. "This is SEAD," Colonel Henderson observed, using the military acronym for suppression of enemy air defenses. "She treated us like a surface-to-air missile threat and used proven penetration tactics to defeat our coverage." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Exactly right, Colonel. Ghost approached the engagement like a special operations mission rather than a traditional air-to-air exercise. She studied the threat, planned her approach, and executed with precision that left no room for error." As the briefing continued, the assembled pilots began to understand that they had witnessed something unprecedented. Kestrel Thorne hadn't simply won an exercise. She had demonstrated that unconventional thinking could triumph over superior technology when applied with sufficient skill and preparation. In the back of the room, Kestrel remained silent, her gray-green eyes fixed on the tactical display. She knew that this moment represented more than personal vindication. It was the beginning of a fundamental change in how the military thought about aerial warfare. The question now was whether that change would come quickly enough to matter when the next real war began. The knock on Kestrel's quarters door came at 2200 hours, well after the official end of the training day. She opened it to find Commander Morrison standing in the hallway, his expression serious and his uniform bearing the slight wrinkles that suggested a very long day of briefings and phone calls with superiors. "Ma'am," Morrison said formally, I need to speak with you about your background, specifically about the 2 years that aren't fully detailed in your service record." Kestrel stepped aside to let him enter, her small quarters suddenly feeling crowded with the weight of unspoken questions. Morrison took a seat at her desk while she remained standing by the window, looking out at the flight line where her Super Hornet sat under the harsh glow of security lights. "Those records are classified, sir," she said simply. "Not anymore. I spent the afternoon on secure calls with people who have clearances I can't even spell." Morrison pulled out a tablet and consulted his notes. "SEAL Team 6, Operation Neptune Spear Follow-Up Missions, Counterterrorism Operations in Afghanistan, Syria, and 3 other countries that are still redacted." Kestrel's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle hardening that spoke of memories best left undisturbed. "What's your question, Commander?" "My question is how a naval aviator ended up embedded with the most elite special operations unit in the military, and why nobody thought to mention that when you were assigned to my squadron." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, a night shift maintenance crew worked on one of the F-35s, their voices carrying across the desert air as they performed the endless ritual of keeping complex machines ready for war. Kestrel watched them work while deciding how much truth she was willing to share. "The SEALs needed an aviator who could think like they do," she said finally. "Someone who understood that conventional tactics get people killed when the stakes are real. I volunteered." "And what did you learn during those 2 years?" Kestrel turned from the window to face Morrison directly. "I learned that survival isn't about having the best equipment or following the most sophisticated playbook. It's about understanding your environment better than your enemies do, and being willing to do things they would never expect." Morrison nodded, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "The counter-ambush tactics you used yesterday, those came from ground operations." "Every principle applies to 3 dimensions instead of 2, Kestrel confirmed. "Use terrain for concealment. Study the enemy before engaging. Strike from unexpected angles. Disappear before they can respond. The SEALs have been perfecting these techniques for decades." "And you brought them to air combat." "I adapted them. The sky has terrain too, radar shadows, commercial air corridors, weather patterns. Most pilots see empty space where special operations soldiers see cover and concealment opportunities." Morrison leaned back in his chair, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd witnessed. Kestrel Thorne hadn't simply outflown 8 superior aircraft. She had applied ground-based special operations tactics to aerial warfare with devastating effectiveness. "The Pentagon is very interested in your methods," he said carefully. "There's talk of establishing a new training program, maybe even a completely new tactical doctrine." Kestrel's smile was barely visible in the dim light of her quarters. "Good, because what we demonstrated yesterday is just the beginning. Everything we think we know about air combat is about to change, and the pilots who adapt first are going to have a significant advantage over those who don't." The implications hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything the military had spent decades perfecting. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the flight line, carrying the promise of transformations yet to come. The classified briefing took place in a windowless room deep within the Pentagon, where men and women with stars on their shoulders and decades of military experience gathered to discuss the implications of a single training exercise in the Nevada desert. The attendees represented every branch of the armed forces, and their collective expertise encompassed air, land, and sea warfare spanning multiple conflicts and countless operational deployments. Admiral Catherine Sterling, Chief of Naval Operations, stood at the head of the conference table while a secure video feed showed highlights from the Wraith Protocol exercise. Her weathered features reflected 30 years of naval service, including combat tour in 3 different theaters, and a reputation for innovative thinking that had earned her both respect and occasional controversy. "The footage speaks for itself," Admiral Sterling began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "One pilot, flying an older generation aircraft, systematically defeated 8 of our most advanced fighters using tactics that aren't taught at any of our schools." General Robert Hayes, Air Force Chief of Staff, leaned forward in his chair. "Catherine, with all due respect, we're talking about one training exercise. Impressive, certainly, but hardly grounds for revolutionizing our entire approach to air combat." "Are we, Bob?" Sterling replied, advancing to the next slide. "Because my analysts have been studying Lieutenant Commander Thorne's service record, and what they've found suggests this wasn't an isolated incident." The display showed a map of Afghanistan with several locations marked in red. Each marker represented a mission where Kestrel had provided air support for SEAL Team 6 operations, and the success rates were remarkable even by special operations standards. "She spent 2 years embedded with our most elite ground units, learning tactics that we've never applied to aerial warfare," Sterling continued. "The results speak for themselves. 0 friendly casualties during close air support missions, successful extraction from compromised positions, and combat effectiveness ratings that exceed anything in our historical records." Lieutenant General Maria Santos, Marine Corps Deputy Commandant for Aviation, studied the data with professional interest. "What kind of tactics are we talking about?" "Counter-ambush operations adapted for three-dimensional warfare," came a new voice from the secure video link. Colonel Morrison appeared on screen from Nellis Air Force Base, his expression serious as he addressed the assembled leadership. "Ghost, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, has developed methods for using terrain masking, electronic deception, and pattern analysis that allow a single aircraft to operate effectively against superior numbers." General Hayes remained skeptical. "These tactics might work in training exercises, but real combat involves variables that can't be simulated." "Actually, sir," Morrison replied, "Lieutenant Commander Thorne's combat record suggests otherwise. She's applied these methods in real-world operations with consistent success. What we witnessed in the Wraith Protocol wasn't an anomaly, it was a demonstration of proven capabilities." The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officers. They were discussing the possibility that everything they thought they knew about air combat might need fundamental revision, based on techniques developed by a single pilot who had learned to think outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. Admiral Sterling consulted her notes before continuing. "I'm recommending that we establish a new training program based on Lieutenant Commander Thorne's methods. We need to understand these tactics and determine how they can be integrated into our existing doctrine." "And if they can't be integrated?" General Hayes asked. Sterling's smile was grim. "Then we develop new doctrine, because if one of our pilots can do this to our own aircraft, we need to assume that potential adversaries are working on similar capabilities. The question isn't whether these tactics work, it's whether we'll adapt to them before someone else does." The